All right.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along today. I know we are juggling multiple time zones at the moment, and thank you very much to Mandy for getting up extremely early. It's already tomorrow morning in Australia, whereas for most of us are still on Thursday. I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion here today on sex bias and cohorts included in sports medicine research. Mandy is a lecturer in the School of Medical Sciences in the University of New South Wales, and Mandy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe focuses primarily on studying resistance training in relation to the potential benefits post-cancer and its treatments, but also more generally in human populations, how sex differences might impact response to training.
Yeah.
If I'm correct, Mandy, you also have a personal interest in this as well, as you train a lot yourself too, yeah?
Yeah. Excuse me, absolutely. Well, I used to train a lot, not so much now.
So yeah, great. We'll pass over to Mandy. As always, people, if you want to put any questions or comments in the chat, and after Mandy's finished her talk, we can hopefully have a discussion. I think there's a lot to unpack here, so hopefully we'll have a good chat. Thanks
awesome. Thank you. I'd just like to start today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm joining this meeting from today, the land of the Bidjigal people. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be joining this meeting today. Thank you to Stork for inviting me to come along and have a chat about our recent paper. I'm pretty excited to be starting what I think is a really important dialogue with you all, because I think we have the opportunity to change the way we do things moving forward. So, you know, we have the ability to make an impact in the space if we want to. I guess I'm a little nervous too, because it's not a topic that's super well discussed in our field, but I think it's a really important conversation to have, and it's really multifaceted, it's really nuanced. It's an area that I need a lot more understanding around myself. So today I'm going to talk about what I currently know, but also acknowledge that there's a lot I still need to learn. Excuse me. So the format I'm going to take today will be a short sort of 20 to 30 minute presentation. Then hopefully the last part will be just a dialogue, a chat with you all to try and talk about how we might approach this problem. So first off, I just want to give a little bit of a caveat. I've had a change in presentation location today. I was going to go into the office, but I'm at home. So I'm hoping that we won't be interrupted by a little toddler, but there's a possibility that we might be. So apologies in advance if I lose my train of thought at some point. Okay, so I thought, seeing as I haven't met many of you before, I'd start with a little bit of an intro. So I'm an academic at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, but I'm a Kiwi. I've been an Aussie for about 10 years now. So I came over here to do my university study or my PhD. So I've got a Bachelor in Sports Science, postgrad diploma in musculoskeletal rehab, Masters in Science specialising in musculoskeletal rehab. I then did my PhD in exercise oncology in the area of breast cancer. In the industry, I've worked as a fitness instructor, a personal trainer, clinically as an exercise physiologist, and I've worked with some elite athletes too. My research, as I said, is primarily centered around resistance training in both clinical populations in terms of maximizing adaptation, but with a particular interest in female adaptations. So in my spare time, I used to dabble a little bit in weightlifting and powerlifting. Now I still lift sometimes, but most of my time is spent with my awesome little family. So I thought I would give you a little bit of context about what has led us to writing the piece that I'm going to talk about today. So as you saw on the previous slide, I used to lift quite often, a little bit. As soon as I started undergrad, and I was exposed to research, I was always trying to apply that literature to myself. And it just frustrated me that I couldn't find much at all that really related to me rather than a college-aged male. So when I retired from Olympic lifting to focus on my PhD, I took up powerlifting because I thought, you know what, I can coach and train myself on my own schedule. And if I miss a session because I'm too busy or too tired, I'm not letting anyone but myself down. It was at that point that I realized the complete lack of female resistance training research. So, excuse me, I used the predominantly male literature base to design my own programs. And I ended up winning a Commonwealth medal about 9 months after I began powerlifting, which was pretty cool. But Like, I wondered, could I have done better if I had an evidence base that related to me? I wanted to know if my sets, my reps, my intensity, and all of the other variables, should they be different than the literature on the male evidence base was telling me? But considering that even the most basic summary hadn't been undertaken in females, I decided to start there. So I asked the question, what is the effect of resistance training in women? So I was a bit apprehensive about submitting this for publication because it's such a simple question. Like, it's definitely not rocket science, right? Do women who lift get stronger and bigger than those who don't? State the obvious, but I still couldn't really understand why all the obvious research had been done on men and not on women. What if we're different? What if our magnitude of adaptation is different? So obviously I want to look at the specific variables, but first I just needed to summarize the literature in the most general manner I could. Unsurprisingly, what we found was that women gained strength and size. So an average of about 1.5 kilos of lean mass and approximately 25% increases in strength. Following your pretty standard resistance training program seen in the academic literature, 3 sets of 10, 3 times a week at about 70% 1RM. What was really, really cool to me, though, is that people cared. People actually wanted to talk about women in strength training and women in research, and it was fantastic. The response was really quite overwhelming. I ended up giving a short talk about the paper at an event where I gave a little bit of spiel, similar to what I'm doing now, about the lack of research on women in exercise and sports medicine. After the talk, I was approached by a really awesome woman, Associate Professor Carolyn Ford. I really wanted to meet and collaborate with her, but I hadn't had a chance since coming to my new institution. She asked, is this standard in your field? And I said, you know what? Unfortunately, I think so. I haven't really seen a great deal of data, or to be honest, I haven't really looked for it. It just seems like so often when I pick up a paper to read it out of general interest, that it doesn't seem to focus or have much inclusion in terms of women participants. And she said, well, I've come across some data. Would you like to collaborate so that you can back your point and write about it? So we ended up writing our letter to the editor on sex bias and cohorts included in sports medicine research. So the data that Carolyn had mentioned came about due to her PhD student, Nicole Uomo's project, looking at cell-free DNA and the factors that influence it. So Carolyn, she leads the gynecological cancer research group, and her team are aiming to develop an early detection blood test for ovarian cancer. And they need to establish what factors might influence cell-free DNA. So cell-free DNA is released from cells that circulate in the bloodstream. It originates from dying cells. Its current uses include liquid biopsy and non-invasive prenatal testing to detect genetic abnormalities in growing fetuses. Cell-free DNA is strongly linked to inflammation, so its response to exercise was of particular interest for this group. So, a search was conducted using a variety of terms related to cell-free DNA and exercise. All studies that specified the number of male and female participants were retained for analysis. So, what was found was that there were 19 studies that conducted their research on males only, with 269 male participants in total. There were 10 studies that conducted their research on both males and females, including 131 males and 80 females. There were no studies that conducted their research on females only. So that meant in our entire kind of subset of data, there were 400 males represented and 80 females represented. That's a 5-to-1 ratio of male to female participants in an outcome that has no sex or gender reason or rationale to have a difference. So when we looked at the studies that recruited male-only cohorts, there was no rationale mentioned or justified in any way of 17 of the 19 studies for the use of the single-sex design. The male cohorts included, they ranged from healthy, physically active, through to recreationally trained, moderately trained, and competitive athletes in a variety of disciplines. So across the spectrum, really. 2 studies justified exclusion based on minimizing hormonal influence or minimizing the effect of the menstrual cycle. Interestingly, the two studies that excluded based on menstrual cycle did so with no evidence base. So recently, Carolyn Ford's team published a paper showing that there is no influence of the menstrual cycle on cell-free DNA, effectively proving that these studies shouldn't have excluded based on a criteria on a possibility. In terms of the 10 studies that did include both sexes, only 2 separated out their data by sex. However, 3 of the studies did at least acknowledge a limitation of single sex in their discussion. So the earliest of these papers was published in, I think it was 2004. However, the majority of the studies were published after 2015. So that really indicates the recency of this data, and it kind of negates that notion that things have gotten better over time and that sex bias really is a thing of the past. So was what we found an isolated example? No, it definitely wasn't. In the broader field of health and medicine, there's a well-documented sex bias in multiple facets of research. So, for example, in 2014, Masha et al. Provided an update about the 20 years since the 1994 implementation of a US federal law, which required researchers funded by the NIH to include women as well as men in clinical studies and to analyse their results by sex or gender. So what these authors highlight is that significant progress has been made, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So some of the key points in this paper that I found fascinating was that there's still a predominant use of male animal and cell models, and that perhaps this might be contributing to the replicability problem facing preclinical biomedical research. So for example, it was reported that in surgical research utilizing animal models, authors didn't report sex 22% of the time. When they did report sex, they used males 80% of the time. In terms of representation on different groups in clinical trials in cancer, there was an approximate 80% of all participants who were white and 60% who were male. These are just a couple of brief examples that I personally found interesting. I'd encourage you to read this paper for a bit of a history lesson if it's something that interests you. So I wanted to go on a little tangent for a moment and discuss an area of possibly interrelated bias that might be influencing what we are seeing in terms of our research participant numbers. So recently, a study from authors here at UNSW came out, and it fascinated me. They found that only 28% of senior authors in medical journals across Australia are female. And it got me thinking, is there a possibility that sex influences the research questions we ask? And is it possible that the sex of the researcher may also influence the participants studied? So historically, doctors, researchers, scientists were predominantly men, and it probably has had an impact on the research that was done in the past. So if this is the case, then I would think that until we increase the women in leadership and the women in senior positions leading research groups, then this disparity in participation rates and around women-centered research is likely to continue. So this is a whole separate yet kind of interrelated facet of equity that I'm not going to go into too much detail in today. So in terms of our field, there's been a bit of recent awareness and discussion around sex bias. In 2014, Costello et al. Conducted an audit of sorts where they examined the number of participants by sex over a 3-year period in the top sport and exercise medicine and science journals, including MedSci Sport Exercise, BJSM, and AJSM. They found that overall, 39% of participants were female, but only 4 to 13% of studies were conducted on solely female participants. So this data was collected from studies that were published between 2011 and 2013, so about 10 years ago. It's quite interesting that this representation of females in this data set is actually greater than what we presented in our current example, particularly given the time frame. More recently, Becker et al. Wrote a piece discussing the concept of all-male panels and experts at sport and medicine conferences. Thorberg expanded on this late last year. These two pieces highlight a different area of sex bias, but as I mentioned in my previous slide, I think a lot of these issues are probably interrelated, and it's important for women to be included at all levels of the hierarchy, not just at the junior level, particularly in places like institutions use metrics like senior authorship and membership on conference panels for promotions. So I think even becoming aware of the data is a step in the right direction. But I think in addition to becoming aware of the data, it's really helpful if we can understand why the data is the way that it is. And that includes understanding the concept of implicit bias. So implicit biases are unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that are shaped by our individual experiences, along with learned associations between things like social categories, or race, sex, gender. Sometimes we're unaware of our biases and they can shape the way that we do things. Becker et al. Discussed the concept of implicit bias in the context of the all-male expert panels, and they stated that rather than being a product of overt malice, it's a manifestation of a bigger, highly complex structural problem. And I think this is probably the case here too. So becoming aware of these biases is the first step in correcting the issue. So, for example, previous research has shown that the words power and strength are more frequently associated with men. Therefore, does that make us as researchers more likely to assume that the male sex is the more appropriate sex to research questions about strength and power? In the example in box 1, which I've taken from Becker et al.'s BJSM piece, provides an example of implicit bias. So, a father and his son are in a car crash. It kills the father. The son is rushed to the hospital. Just as he's about to undergo surgery, the surgeon says, "I cannot operate. The boy is my son." Who is the surgeon? Stories like this are circulated all the time by women in all sorts of different roles and fields. I've definitely experienced this numerous times myself, both professionally, like when I first started out as an academic, and I got the, "You're an academic? Was it because I was so young, I was female, I was small, I'm a bit goofy?" Whatever it was because I didn't fit the individual's perspective of what an academic should be. It's also happened more times than I can count with respect to my sport performance. You can't really be a lifter, you're so petite, but your favorite color is pink. Absurd, right? And these are just some of my experiences. And I'm sure every single one of you on the call has been on the receiving end of others' implicit biases in the past. So, in the grand scheme of things, why does it matter? Well, there are numerous sex differences in terms of physiology, such as differences in the amount and the composition of skeletal muscle, the differences in lung size. These differences manifest in exercise differences, such as reduced fatigability in females due to greater type 1 muscle fibers, due to greater levels of perfusion. There are myriad other differences too. For example, in the time course to recovery, research has shown that females take longer to recover following damaging resistance training. So this might have practical applications for the periodization and prescription of high-intensity exercise. We also know that there are sex differences in injury rates and outcomes. So for example, women are almost twice as likely to have an ACL injury. The type of injury sustained running also differs by sex. And recently, there's been a bit of focus on concussion. Williams et al. Have just shown that the mechanisms of concussion differ between sexes. And as such, the current prevention programs based on male data aren't appropriate for women. So this area is really too broad to list and to discuss all of the sex differences in physiology and in injury research. However, if you fancy a read that helps explain why these differences are important, then Ancelotta et al. Published a great review last year titled "Physiological Sex Differences Affect the Integrative Response to Exercise: Acute and Chronic Implications." In this review, Ansel discusses sex differences and how the physiological response to theoretical equivalent doses of exercise aren't the same in males and females, and that this means there's a possibility that females may receive a suboptimal dose of exercise when programs are based on data from male participants. So, what can we do about it? I guess this is the big ticket item, isn't it? What can we do about the underrepresentation of females in exercise-based research? So I have a few ideas, but mostly I welcome discussion around the ideas I'm going to present now, and then any other ideas that you guys might have. So I think the more discourse we have, the better. So first off, I think that the reporting of sex in title and abstract is a great place to start. The Institute of Medicine recommends that the title and abstract should indicate whether a study involves men or women only. And I think this concept should be translated to sport and exercise science. So the default lack of mention of sex should only occur when the study pertains to and examines both sexes. So think about how often you read an article and the article doesn't mention sex. And then you read on just to discover that the study was conducted in males only. Do you find that the same thing happens with studies on women? Or do you think that when you pick up a study on women, it's identified as such, as they are still perceived as unique and not the norm? So think about it, I guess, from an example in a slightly different light. When you're watching TV or you're listening to the radio and you're getting a sports update, why are the sports results so often reported only by sex to mention women's results? So the male results might just be reported as this team beat this team in this code. When it's the female team or the women's team, it's often specified that you are hearing the results pertaining to women. So why should the default be male? And I think the same approach should apply to our research. One sex shouldn't be the default. This kind of language reiterates bias, whether it's implicit or not. I think another step to address this issue requires researchers a priori to justify their use of single-sex cohorts, and that this should be upheld and enforced by editors and peer reviewers. Another small change that will be really helpful and beneficial will be to improve our reporting of sex disaggregated data. The sample size is too small to analyse by sex, which really in exercise science is pretty much all the time. Then either recruit more participants, which obviously isn't always feasible, then perhaps just appendicize sex disaggregated data so that we have access to that data. I think another really important step that we as researchers, peer reviewers, and editors can do is to reframe our concept of novelty. If a study has been conducted in one sex only, then it's still novel to conduct the study in the opposite sex. So I've heard countless anecdotes, particularly with respect to sports performance, where researchers have had trouble publishing female sports performance or testing data as it's not been deemed novel, despite the fact it's never been done in women, yet done multiple times in men. And I think this really, it just has to stop. These sex biases in the review process, unfortunately, really are disturbingly common. As part of a team examining sex differences, we've received blatantly sexist peer review comments like, what's the point in studying them? By them, I'm assuming they mean women, when we already know what the results will be. Another pillar was something along the lines of course women fatigue less, they're weaker. So I think here it's the responsibility of all of us at all levels to acknowledge and call out this kind of bias, because it's probably contributing to the smaller number of studies published on female participants. So another concept which is quite interesting is the concept of quotas. I think this approach has some strong pros and some strong cons. Sometimes in research, single-sex samples are appropriate and warranted. Other times, I think instigating a quota may lead to lower sample sizes overall. But I guess on the flip side, quotas can normalise things and perhaps normalise the presence of females in more facets of research. I'm not overly convinced that quotas would fix everything though, because while it would give women the option of signing up, it doesn't mean that they will, which brings me to my next point. How are we recruiting our participants? So there is a distinct possibility that less women volunteer for certain types of research than men. But I think we need to actually ask why that might be the case and what can we do about it to address it. So it definitely isn't a simple discussion point. Although it's not an example from research output or a participant perspective, I thought I'd give you a little bit of an example of a possible unintentional perpetuation of some of these biases from my own research team. So I lead a small group. Currently at UNSW, I've got a PhD student, an honours student, and 3 research interns. Externally, I'm supervising another PhD student and a master's student. So I have 7 students in my broader research group. They're all men. So it's very unusual for female students to approach me to join my team. And in recent months, I've been giving it quite a bit of thought and thinking, why is it the case? And should it be the case? And what can I do about it? So firstly, I love resistance training. And this is a sport and an exercise modality. Historically and probably currently has a greater participation and interest from males. So from that perspective, it does kind of make sense. Secondly, is the research around resistance training that's presented to the students early in their degree likely more focused on males? And if this is the case, which it probably is, as more resistance training work is done on males, does this make the young woman think that this research area isn't for them? Or is it actually on me? Is it the way in which I recruit and grow my team? So I'm very much a passive recruiter of students. I wait for students to approach, then I interview to decide on compatibility. Maybe passive recruitment isn't the way to go to attract high caliber female students to join my team. Perhaps my recruitment approach may need to differ here, where I actively seek out and target female students to join my group. So I know that I connect well with undergraduate women. It just doesn't transfer into postgraduate research in my area. And I wonder whether that same thought process needs to occur in our research recruitment, where we need to think, is there something about the way in which I'm recruiting that tends to appeal more to males? Or is there some barrier or barriers that are preventing women from signing up in more equal numbers? So if you're confused about how to include women participants in your research, there are comprehensive guidelines and recommendations around conducting research throughout the menstrual cycle and considering factors such as oral contraceptive use. If you're unsure of your research design or methodology needs to be adapted or altered in some way, consult an expert. Don't simply exclude women based on the fact that they have hormonal fluctuations. I do want to make a point here, though, and that this is an entirely different specialist area of research in which I'm definitely not an expert. I think there seems to be this misnomer that all female exercise science research is centered on the menstrual cycle. Research into female exercise physiology and female sport and performance most certainly does encompass understanding of the menstrual cycle, but it's one component of research on women. And not all study designs will require alteration based on the menstrual cycle. So one of the last points I also want to make is that the research question shouldn't have to focus or examine sex differences for us to include females as research participants. If the question is not about sex differences, then the inclusion of both sexes is likely the most appropriate design, unless the question specifically doesn't allow the inclusion of both sexes. So don't get me wrong, I have done a lot of the things that I've just mentioned here, like not specifying sex in the title and not appendicizing sex disaggregated data. But I really think that the important thing is scientists, researchers, and obviously just people, humans in general, is that we learn and we adapt and we are open to changing our view and our processes, especially when we're in fields like scientific research. I obviously don't have all the answers today, and my goal from today was really just to raise awareness, start a dialogue, and to get us all thinking about our biases, whether they're implicit or not, and to think, how can we do better? What small or large changes can we make in study design, analysis, presentation of data, and recruitment that will help us to increase our understanding of human physiology? I'd just like to say a quick thank you to my collaborators from each of the pieces of research I mentioned here. Routine, without us, the rest of the team, this work wouldn't exist. I also particularly want to thank Associate Professor Carolyn Ford. The topic of this letter is something that I've wanted to broach since starting in this field, but I wouldn't have done it without your encouragement, and I wouldn't have done it without data to help illustrate my point, which you guys helpfully provided. I also want to thank Nicole Uomo for doing the legwork on this data as part of your PhD. Awesome, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandy. So interesting, so many thoughts buzzing around the head now after all that. And I guess now let's open up to discussion. What way do you prefer to do this? I can see that there's lots of messages popping up in the chat. So either we can kind of, anyone who wants, just unmute yourself and read out your questions and comments, or otherwise we can read them out here. So anybody want to get started? I don't want to, I have like so many questions and comments, but I always do. I need to. So if we just get going with the chat, with what we have here. First
I'll
one.
go ahead and, oh, sorry, go ahead. I was going to go ahead with my question I posted in the chat. So I did my PhD at McMaster, where there's Stu Phillips, Marty Gabal, a lot of the muscle phys people that do plenty of work. And some of my colleagues around 2014 to 2018 started talking about how there was a lack of females in a lot of these studies. And some of the qualitative findings or reasons that they found from females was just the apprehension to getting muscle biopsies done and the associated scarring that would be with it. Thinking that men kind of wear longer bathing suits as opposed to women where it would be more visible. They said this is one of the reasons why a lot of females were apprehensive to doing it, as opposed to the female grad students that were running these studies. They were getting them done nonstop. So I wonder if that's one of the many reasons why.
I think that's a really important point, and it probably is. I mean, obviously, we have so many differences, males and females, physiologically, socioculturally, and the reasons which I guess may make women apprehensive in research are going to be different. And I guess, in certain things like, muscle biopsy, we can't change the technique, right? But we can think about how else can we answer, or at least, I guess, add data and knowledge to this area, while, I guess, respecting and understanding that maybe this specific method or approach may be less common or less commonly accepted in females. And I mean, yeah, I think it's a great point.
Deborah, I'm not sure if I heard correctly. Was this coming directly from the female participants themselves, or was this the perception of the research team? Because sometimes I think there can be assumptions about women.
So this would be a lot of the feedback that the research team, who many of them were females as well, were getting from the individuals they were approaching to be in the study and why they wouldn't want to be in it.
I think I had don't know if it's a comment or a question, something that I was just thinking as you were talking, and you touched on it towards the end there, was that it kind of feels like the bar is so much higher for if you want to include women, because you have to very carefully justify it. I don't by any means think that we should lower the bar to make it easier to include women, but I suppose what can we do to increase the bar for including male participants? How can we encourage people to explain why they chose men? I think it just feels like difficult.
Yeah, it's a hard one, and I do think open science is going to play a role here, right? And I think that with our kind of move to pre-registration and being clear and transparent with everything that we've done at each process, I think that can encourage the justification of single-sex cohorts a bit better and try and push for inclusion. Because if we, in a protocol, specifically state we're going to include one sex, I think we should have a solid physiological rationale for why. And I think, even if that protocol isn't being peer-reviewed, when the study comes to an editor's desk, it should be questioned. And I have heard from colleagues, one colleague told me recently they had a paper rejected because it was a male-only cohort and they didn't justify it. But so when they told me that this journal has this policy, I went and I had a look. And the journal doesn't have a policy. It was obviously an individual editor that had picked up on it and said, you know what, it's not appropriate unless you explain it. So I think, if there are editorial policies saying that we have to clearly talk about our, choice to include both sexes. I think the thing, if we are going to say use a quota or something like that in our research design and pre-registration, that can make things quite difficult because we might just end up with less data overall. And I guess in terms of, progressing science, that's not what we want. So while I want to normalize women participants in research, I don't want to limit scientific progression or understanding either.
That's a tricky one. There's some interesting comments here from Jennifer. I hadn't thought of this perspective. Works with adults over 65, and since women live longer than men, that means that there's more women in the participant pool, and times along the research process, having to defend the recruitment process was to show that we're actively working to recruit men. I haven't really thought of that depending on the situation you're in.
Yeah. Yep, I have noticed the same trend that in older adult research, excuse me, there is more female participants in a lot of facets of it. And that, I guess, partly is explained by the longevity and aging. I guess it also depends on the clinical research question. So obviously in an area like breast cancer, it's a women's health, or predominantly women's health condition, and breast cancer survivors are super keen to be research participants. They're easier to recruit than a lot of other clinical cohorts. So, I mean, I guess it's a bit of a generalization, but I think a lot of the data and the context I was talking about today is a little bit more applied. It tends to be younger, healthy adults in the sport frame, or in just general understanding of exercise physiology. But I can completely agree.
We study strength and power in older adults. And so, yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, there is more out there about women because there are more women alive at this age, but I didn't even think, they're like, well, why do you have more women's in the participant pool? Weren't you trying to recruit men? And I was like, yes, we were, but, and it just it's discouraging to have to defend that a little bit.
Do you think we need? Sorry, Mandy. I was going to just butt in there and say, well, first of all, thanks for an excellent presentation. For when there are like open recruitment calls for things like exercise physiology research, which is I think you're referring to, because obviously recruitment's a little bit different, like clinically for cancer survivors and things. Do we need different recruitment strategies for males and females? Do you think that might even out the recruitment a little bit?
I do, and I haven't spent enough time looking into this side of the research yet, because it's a little bit outside of my comfort zone, but I do, and I've been thinking about it for my current PhD student. He's just about to launch a clinical trial in RCT, and it's resistance training, as pretty much everything I do. And I've been trying to think about how we can try and more effectively target women. And I mean, it could be basic things like on our recruitment posters, making sure that we have images of females as well as males, really little things that we might not tend to think about. And I do think we need different recruitment strategies. I just don't know what they are yet, unfortunately. And I think, that same kind of thing with me recruiting students to my team. I have such a good relationship with undergraduate women, and I don't understand why they're not coming to join my team. And I think, I should take responsibility for that to some degree. Obviously, I'm probably always going to have more of a male presence on my team because of my field of research. But surely there's one, at least, undergraduate woman with an interest and an expertise in strength training. And I think it will be the same with our participants. So I don't know if we need to take a more active approach, or I don't know, maybe even as simple as where we're advertising or the wording we're using in our advertisements. Maybe it could even be the old, in my area of strength training, in certain groups, there's still the fear from women of being perceived as big and bulky and muscular and all of these traits associated with manliness, So maybe it's the wording we use with "come join our study." I'm not sure, but I do think so.
I often wonder, where does, I get that the thing of oh, maybe I'll get really big and bulky. Do people have any idea of the amount of work that it takes to get into the gym or taking part in a short study? That's bloody hard work to bulk up that much. It's
I know. And when I started, I was a competitive athlete in a couple of team sport codes before transferring into Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting. I got smaller and smaller as I started lifting. So I just, obviously I did put on muscle mass, and I personally don't have a problem with having muscles. But yeah, I think there's a little bit of a misconception about the magnitude of body changes that are going to occur in a short period of time, and offset that with the improvements that you're going to see and feel. I think, maybe we're not even doing a good job at communicating that, which again, I guess is on, us a little bit to improve our dialogue around expectations from training.
There's a few different comments here and questions in the chat, and they're all quite long, so I'm kind of listening and reading at the same time. Ryan,
I'll go then. Hi, I just put a comment in the chat that Emer said. Well, I know Emer, so I'll just sort of say it to you directly. It was more just a comment, and I don't know like what your opinion would be on this. So you mentioned in your presentation, obviously, that just because it has been done in men, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done in women. And so I had almost sort of the opposite experience in a way, in that sort of there was some research done in the area that we study in kind of sports nutrition. And I thought like, it would be quite interesting to do this in women, because there's some, kind of other data that suggests that maybe they would respond differently. And so then when I sort of brought this idea, just asking for kind of feedback from a kind of a fairly senior researcher in the area, they kind of sort of immediately dismissed it and saying kind of, just because it hasn't been done in women, it doesn't mean it should be done in women. And kind of despite sort of me bringing some physiological arguments to the table, it kind of was dismissed, and it actually put me off actually then kind of doing that study. So, just having that alternate experience was a bit, I don't know, odd and shocking in a way.
I guess that's the similar to what I was trying to say, and I'm sorry, that's absolute rubbish, really. I think if regardless of which sex has been studied, both sexes need to be studied. So it's not always, often obviously the talk I'm giving is from the direction of increase in research on women, but that's not, it's not always the direction of the bias. Excuse me. So I think, if research has been done on one sex only, or the data is only clear on one sex at a given point, we need to improve the research on other sexes. And I think, I think maybe, I want to say times are changing. I mean, the current state of just the world in general, not just academia, is there's a push for equality, and there's a push for equity, and there's a push for openness. And I think as new generations of researchers come through, we will be able to hopefully, argue that bit better about, no, this still needs to be done. And I think, hopefully, as more junior researchers move into editorial positions and things like that, that's when these sort of changes, will be made. And some of the stories that I'd heard about, it was particularly women cricket research. I've heard a bunch of stuff from researchers about, there's been all this research on testing batteries in men, and they were just trying to publish it on women, and they were told, no, it's boring, it's not novel, we're not publishing it. It is important. It's the same. What if the tests give different indications? What if they're not as useful for men as women? I mean, for women as men, or whatever it may be, right? So, yeah, I completely agree, and I'm sorry you had that experience.
Thanks. No, I agree. Interesting.
This is something that I find that I kind of struggle to get in my own head around, because I think that there's certainly a drive, I think, to improve this, which I think is 100% the right, and 100% behind sorting these issues out. However, I think that there is also a bit of a, I don't even know what I'm saying. Let's just say, for example, there are certain studies that probably shouldn't have been done in the first place. Obviously, Brian, that you're proposing, but there are certain studies that maybe weren't well justified in the first place, or anything. And then if somebody wants to kind of, oh well, now I'm going to replicate in women because it hasn't been done before, I think there has to be more than just we need to replicate this. And I think in the last couple of years, there has probably been an awful lot of research that's come out that's like, oh, but it's in women, so it's important. It's like, well, the question still, I think we should always justify our population, but the question still has to be first and foremost the focus. And I do think that there's been a little bit, maybe the pendulum sometimes swinging a little too far the opposite way, in that people are using occasionally, oh, well, it's in women, so therefore it must be published. But that's, I don't know, do you think that's happening at all? Or?
Yes, I do. So I think nothing should take away from good science, yeah. I guess, first and foremost. You know, you have a research question, you have a hypothesis, you design your study and your statistical analysis to test that question, and sex is a part of that. And I think, you know, obviously, if a well-designed study is being done on males only, then it should be done on females. But I completely agree. If some rubbish work has been done, don't replicate rubbish. It's still rubbish, regardless of what sex it's on. So I do agree. And I think, you know, that there is potentially, unfortunately, which is a more negative than positive, having an increased amount of lower quality work is actually a detractor. I think, you know, it's better to have an evidence base that may be smaller but is of higher quality. And unfortunately, we're just not quite hitting that balance at the moment. So, I totally agree with your point.
Question that I'd like to put out to the group in general, because it's something that I'm not quite sure how to justify in my own head. There's been certain studies that I've been planning.
I've lost you. I can't hear you. Can everyone else hear you?
Am I okay? I don't know. Sam was saying.
I can hear you, Emer.
Okay, I'll carry on. Mandy, did you drop out there for a moment? Essentially, I'll type it after. I'll put it out. So I'll put it out to the group because I'm not sure myself what I think about this. There are certain studies where I feel like I'm studying something that has probably a very small effect. I need to do everything to minimize external sources of variation. There is a potential that sex hormones might impact. However, if I do my study on women, I need to control to menstrual cycle phase, which is going to massively increase the amount of time. So it's just a much more complex study if I choose female participants. And then I'm kind of like, oh, I shouldn't be using the difficulty as a barrier. But I think that, like, sometimes you kind of have to be practical as well. And if your study doesn't, I don't even know what I'm saying myself. Is it justifiable to choose to do it only on men for practical reasons? If there's a potential that sex hormones might impact your outcomes and you don't have the resources to only be able to test on a couple of days each month.
If I'm Emer, I've completely understand where you're coming from. I've almost feel guilty now after Mandy's excellent talk for using that strategy previously, and I've definitely used that strategy previously, thinking that we've got, particularly I think as a postdoc, when you run time restricted contracts, I think when I've got 6 months to collect data, I want it to be as practical as possible. And I have definitely used that route, particularly in exercise physiology, when you are trying to, find small effects in response to a stimulus, like looking at different biological markers or serological markers or something like that. And I have definitely used that rationale previously. I'm thinking from what I've read in Mandy's excellent talk and things that no, that's probably not okay. And what of my rational justification, it's probably not. It isn't justifiable, and that's the way I'm thinking at the moment. And one of my questions was going to be, but I know, Mandy, you did briefly address this with, I think it was one of the papers via Kirsty Sale, was there are some guidelines on this, I believe, at the moment, and I wondered if how for a simple person, how simple they were, how, step by step and sort of easy they were, and which may increase the willingness of people to engage females in research?
I think it's a really, really tricky one, hey, and I completely get the complexity. I guess there are two things here to unpack. The first is while if you think hormonal fluctuations may influence your outcome, that's different from if you know hormonal fluctuations may influence your outcome, right? And in the study here, we found a couple of studies that excluded based on this hormonal possibility, but the evidence shows that the menstrual cycle didn't influence the construct that we assessed in our letter, right? So while the menstrual cycle does have an effect on a lot of things, it doesn't have an effect on everything. And I think excluding based on a possibility is worse than excluding based on a known. So I think they're two different things. And then I guess, the pragmatic approach, it has to be taken into consideration, right? The cost and the time, like you said, Sam, limited term contracts and the time to get research done is a really valid and it's a real thing for many people, right? So the recommendations provided, they're pretty clear, I think, but even for me, like menstrual cycle research isn't something that I have a great deal of understanding on. So if I was conducting a study, I probably would actually still seek help just to sort of check, like, am I monitoring the right phase of the cycle for what I'm trying to assess or something like that. A lot of my current research doesn't have an influence of menstrual cycle that I'm aware of. I could be back here in 10 years giving an apology for having done all my research wrong. But at present, I think that, if you're unsure, I would ask how you can perhaps, even if you can't fully take everything into consideration, there might be a couple of practical steps you can do, such as ensuring body composition or whatever it may be, or your biological sample is taken at the same point in a menstrual cycle phase, rather than just saying, I'm going to take my biological sample on a Monday morning. Perhaps you use ovulation kits and you take whatever your biological sample is with respect to that, or something along those lines.
Thanks, Mandy. I guess it's a little bit of a vicious circle because there probably hasn't been a lot of research done with women in exercise science, so we probably don't understand the effect of the menstrual cycle on a lot of these outcomes. So,
because I'm thinking about my outcome that I'm thinking of, and as far as I know, it's only been studied twice, and one showed no effect of menstrual cycle, and the other showed an effect. Both in small samples. But I suppose my concern about, I was kind of like, right, to err on the safe side, I should control for menstrual cycle phase because it's a variable outcome anyway. I need to hammer this down to isolate as much as possible. However, I have 5 conditions and it's crossover. So if I have only a couple of days per month to test, that means any one person takes 5-6 months, and the potential for, say, training nutrition status for biological variability within that period of time. Whereas if I choose men, I can test them every couple of weeks and I can get it all done. So there's just so much to unpack. I can't quite decide myself what's the best approach. But like Sam says, if I don't do it, well, then there'll be less information to inform in it. It's tricky.
I don't think there's. Oh, sorry, Vanessa, you go.
No, I was just going to comment that I think, if you do it on, I think that justification is fine. But then I think that what the problem is if people transfer that data to women. And just when we're talking about the menstrual cycle, like just the idea of accounting for it. But we also have to remember that the menstrual cycle is not like everybody has 26 days or 28 days, right? Like it can be crazy. So at some point, I think people just need to do the research and we need to like sort through and get some data instead of going like maybe like, and then depending on their training, right? They could have no cycle for a while.
Portion of the population as well. It sometimes feels like if you start pulling on the thread, it just goes further and further and further, and next thing you've convinced yourself to do nothing. And I think that's what kind of puts me off almost as researching women such as myself, is that it just feels like the bar is so much higher. It's just so much easier to default to men.
Like I agree, and I definitely, my intent from today's talk wasn't to discourage research in women or to try and seem like there's some kind of mandate that everything should be done equally. It's not possible and not a pragmatic approach. But even if I'm sure there are a lot of research questions at the moment that don't have quite that level of complexity, and that we could improve overall anyway, right? And I definitely am of the view that data is better than no data if it's good data, and because we can still learn from that. So while what Vanessa said is really important, that we shouldn't necessarily be extrapolating data found on one sex to the other without questioning it, it can still be helpful. So think about ACL injuries and how I mentioned women are almost twice as likely to get an ACL injury. So a lot more research has actually been done on ACL injuries in women than in men. And this has actually led to the improvement of treatments for ACL injuries in men. So it's kind of the reverse, right? Like, we're still progressing science and progressing our understanding. It's just, I guess, can we consider things when possible?
The ACL injury and also the energy availability literature is quite interesting, and that is kind of the reverse, in that it's mainly done in women, and now there's suddenly oh, but hold on, this impacts men too. We need to figure this out. But yeah, so much to unpack.
There is.
But I think really, like you really demonstrated just how far-reaching the potential consequences of these kind of things are. And Denver made a really good point there. Like, big pharma, it's all based on men. Do we know that we've got the dosing guidelines right? It really does. Consequences are quite huge when you start thinking about it.
Absolutely.
Guys, I think we're coming up to the hour. Does anybody have any last comments, questions? Vanessa's, yeah, the osteoporosis research is a big one as well. There's certain areas where it gets.
Yeah, and I mean, that's always going to be the case, right? There's always going to be areas in which the research is more predominant on one sex over the other, and that's okay. It's just not okay for the whole evidence base across the spectrum when there is no justification for that bias to exist.
I suppose it all comes right away back to the very beginning. What's your question? What you're trying to answer? And
yeah,
then after that, it'll probably become easy to justify our populations for other people. But yeah, that's no small ask either. Mandy, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. I was jotting notes and making different things, and so much to think about and so much to unpack, but I thought it was a fantastic presentation. So thank you so much for coming along.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for all your questions. I haven't read the chat. I'm not very good at multitasking this kind of stuff, so I will read it, and thank you for everyone who popped something in the chat.
I was trying to keep up with questions, but I was also trying to continue with the conversation. So I was kind of, everyone was putting in really detailed comments, so I was kind of scanning that at the same time.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm going to stop recording now. Yeah.